John Lennon sang about world peace, but behind closed doors, he had a terrifying temper. One night at Paul McCartney's birthday bash, the DJ made a joke about Lennon's recent honeymoon. John Lennon snapped and turned the party into a horror show. John Lennon wasn't a saint, not by a long shot. He cheated, provoked, and lashed out. But he also wrote songs that shook the soul and reshaped modern music. He never stopped pushing boundaries. Yet, even as he rocketed to fame, he couldn't outrun the chaos he carried inside. Love him or hate him, John Lennon never played it safe. And that's exactly why the world couldn't, and still can't, look away. Lennon didn't rebel just for the heck of it. He rebelled because the world had wounded him early and often. When he was born on October 9th, 1940, in Liverpool during a brief pause in the ongoing German air raids, his father, Alfred, was nowhere to be found. A merchant sailor, Alfred spent most of his time at sea, while Lennon's mother, Julia, struggled to raise her son alone. But that was just the beginning of a family scandal that would shake Lennon's world to its core. When John Lennon was just 4, his life veered straight into soap opera territory. His father vanished without a trace, going AWOL from the Navy. And if that wasn't dramatic enough, the money he'd been sending the family suddenly dried up too. Months dragged by with no word. And just as his mother began to rebuild her life, reality hit her with another twist. Imagine opening the door to your missing husband only for him to see that you're bursting at the seams, pregnant with a child that couldn't possibly be his. Although Alfred had finally been ready to play the part of family man, his comeback plans went up in smoke. It was the kind of moment that could crack a family in two, and it did. Julia's prim and proper sister, Mimi, childless, stern, and completely over Julia's lifestyle, swooped in on a rescue mission. Before long, young John Lennon was living under Mimi's roof. It was a bizarre solution, and it only got weirder from there. John Lennon was not lacking male role models. Mimi's husband, the kind and steady George, encouraged Lennon's musical spark by gifting him his first harmonica. But not all the men in Lennon's life had such pure intentions. When Lennon was 5, his father popped back up and offered to take the boy on a trip to Blackpool. Julia, who may have been flaky but not stupid, had a bad feeling about it. On the day of the trip, Julia and her new man were on the case. The pair tailed John and Alfred, only to discover they weren't heading to Blackpool at all. Alfred was planning to snatch the boy and haul him off to New Zealand. When Julia confronted the pair, she absolutely lost it as young John Lennon stood there, likely trembling. Alfred backed off, and life returned to normal, for now. It's hard to imagine how bewildered Lennon must have felt. His mother didn't raise him, but she did drop by Mimi's for visits. When she came around, it wasn't lullabies and bedtime stories. Instead, she spun Elvis records, cracked jokes, and taught Lennon how to play the banjo. She was a whirlwind of chaos, charm, and charisma, more a pal than a parent. Later in life, John Lennon would make a jaw-dropping confession about his feelings during this era. To say that John's relationship with his mother was complicated is like saying the Beatles were kind of popular. Try abandonment, lust, and a healthy dose of emotional turmoil. In a jaw-dropping 1979 interview, Lennon confessed that when he was 14, he felt physically attracted to Julia. Yes, you heard that right. Teenage hormones plus unresolved maternal issues equals one deeply uncomfortable revelation. In that same 1979 interview, Lennon took things to a whole new level of stomach churning. He recalled lying in bed next to Julia and accidentally brushing up against her. Instead of recoiling in horror, he admitted, "I was wondering if I should do anything else." Presumably, she would have allowed it. Yikes. And just when you thought it couldn't get any messier, his story barrels into tragedy. Teenage years are usually messy, but Lennon's were downright brutal. At 14, he lost one of the only stable figures in his life, his Uncle George, Mimi's husband and the closest thing he had to a stable father figure. One minute, George was at home, and the next, he collapsed from a sudden liver hemorrhage and died at just 52 years old. The loss shattered Lennon, but heartbreak wasn't done with him just yet. In fact, this was just a warm-up. Like any rebellious teenager with a secret passion, Lennon had to get a little sneaky. Luckily, his accomplice was his own mother. At 15, she bought him his first guitar, but had it delivered to her house so Aunt Mimi wouldn't flip out. Practical to a fault, she said, "The guitar's all very well, John, but you'll never make a living out of it." We're all laughing now, but at the time, her jab added a whole new layer of splinters to the chip already weighing down on his shoulders. Every teen clashes with authority, but other than Aunt Mimi, John Lennon's life didn't have too many obstacles. In 1957, things were actually looking up. He was going to Liverpool College of Arts, and had started a band called the Quarrymen, and even scored a girlfriend, fellow student Cynthia Powell. But just as the pieces of his life were starting to fall into place, fate came along to complicate things, again. In 1958, just 3 years after losing Uncle George, 17-year-old Lennon's world was shattered again. His mother, Julia, was hit by a car after visiting Mimi's house, and just like that, she was gone. Her violent and sudden demise ignited a seething rage that would simmer inside him for years. Lennon later told one interviewer that he lost her twice, when I was 5 and moved in with my aunt, and then again when she physically passed. Post-World War II England wasn't exactly bursting at the seams with therapists, so Lennon had no choice but to channel that fury into something, and it changed everything. Lennon threw his broken heart and soul into the Quarrymen. The band, now comprised of right-hand man Paul McCartney and McCartney's quiet friend George Harrison, along with Stuart Sutcliffe on bass and drummer Pete Best, started to build a buzz. Only 2 years after Julia's passing, they scored a 48-night residency in Hamburg, Germany. A horrified Aunt Mimi begged Lennon to stay in art school. Thank goodness he didn't listen. World War II may have been over, but the British were still invading Germany in the early 60s. Well, kind of. British music was heading over to the seedy clubs of Hamburg in droves to play marathon sets for dangerous crowds. But it was also the perfect boot camp for the Beatles. Of course, uppers were everywhere, and they helped too. McCartney later said that for every one pill he took, Lennon would take 4 or 5. It was the beginning of a chemical journey that would take Lennon everywhere.
From highs, lows, and to much worse.
John Lennon had a temper, and when it flared, it could be terrifying. While dating Cynthia Powell, he completely lost it after seeing his bandmate Stuart Sutcliffe, with his James Dean looks, dancing with her. Lennon didn't just fume, he lashed out and hit Powell so hard that her head slammed against the wall. But what makes it even more disturbing, the root of his jealousy may have had a lot more to do with Sutcliffe. Around this time, Lennon's close friendship with bandmate Sutcliffe began to raise eyebrows. In public, Lennon tormented Sutcliffe, often mocking him, embarrassing him, and pushing his buttons. But behind closed doors, that's where things got strange. Though Lennon publicly tormented Sutcliffe, their private dynamic was something else entirely. When Stuart was bedridden, he would write Lennon emotional 30-page letters. Some people, including Sutcliffe's sister, believed they were more than friends. She once said, "I have known in my heart for years that Stuart and John had an intimate relationship." Maybe Lennon's rage wasn't about love triangles. Perhaps it was triggered by thought of losing the one person who understood him. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened. One night in May 1961, on the streets of Hamburg, Lennon lost control in the most horrifying way possible. According to Sutcliffe's sister, Pauline, the two friends got into a heated argument about Sutcliffe's plan to leave the band and return to art school. Lennon snapped, punching Sutcliffe and booting him in the head like a man possessed. Lennon looked down at what he'd done, turned on his heel, and ran. On April 10th, 1962, about a year after Lennon's violent outburst, Stuart Sutcliffe collapsed and passed out from the sudden brain hemorrhage. According to his sister Pauline, it wasn't a mystery. She believed that Lennon's brutal kicks to the head were the cause. Even more haunting, much later, a remorseful Lennon allegedly told Yoko Ono that he had been wearing pointy cowboy boots that night. Stuart Sutcliffe had been gone for barely 2 months when John Lennon's girlfriend, Cynthia Powell, delivered some shocking news. She was pregnant, and the timing couldn't be worse. It was July 1962, and Beatlemania was just starting to heat up. Lennon made a pretty bizarre parenting choice after his son Julian was born on April 8th, 1963. He skipped the birth entirely. Sure, it might have been expected, considering his own father had been absent, but Alfred Lennon hadn't jetted off to Spain with his gay manager while his wife tended to a newborn. People were shocked, but when one person dared to call him out, John Lennon didn't just clap back, he exploded. Armageddon struck during Paul McCartney's 21st birthday bash in Liverpool. The Beatles were on the rise, and the party was packed with stars, suits, and scenesters, but one guest was a walking Molotov cocktail. John Lennon, who later admitted he was out of his mind with drinking. When Bob Wooler, a popular DJ, made the mistake of joking about Lennon's Spanish honeymoon, Lennon snapped, but we'll get to the horrifying details of that a little later on. By 1965, Lennon was technically living the dream, but it felt more like a nightmare. He'd packed on some extra pounds, felt creatively stuck, and was fed up with Beatles concerts that sounded more like screaming contests than music. Then came the night it all changed. At a dinner party hosted by George Harrison's dentist,
Who secretly spiked the coffee with illegal substances.
Lennon and Harrison had no idea what was coming. But that trip cracked their world wide open and sent the Beatles' music hurtling in a wild new direction. Lennon and Harrison's first trip changed everything, so much so they could barely relate to McCartney and Starr afterwards. The solution? Get the other Beatles to drop too. Ringo Starr was game, but McCartney wasn't having it. He was terrified of losing control and never thinking the same way again. As John Lennon put it, Paul felt very out of it because we were all slightly cruel, sort of. We're all taking it and you're not. That was the moment a tiny crack formed in the Fab Four, and it would only grow.
Once Lennon began experimenting, everything changed.
Especially the music. Harrison brought in the sitar, and Lennon's lyrics shifted from bubblegum to Buddhism.
But as trippy as everything was,
nothing compared to the muse who was about to blow Lennon's mind for good. By 1967, John had shed his old skin, and the new John wasn't on the same wavelength as his wife, Cynthia. One 1967 incident made this heartbreakingly clear. As the Beatles boarded a train to a Mediterranean retreat, a law officer stopped Powell cold. Lennon didn't notice. The train pulled away, leaving her standing on the platform alone. But the true confirmation that the marriage was over, that came later, and it was far more devastating. In 1968, Cynthia returned home from a vacation in Greece, one her husband had practically shoved her into, only to walk into a nightmare. There, in her home, sat Lennon and a strange woman wearing nothing but bathrobes. His reaction? A casual, "Oh, hi." Cynthia later wrote, "The cruelty of John's betrayal was hard to absorb. After Cynthia cooled off, Lennon assured her that this woman, Yoko Ono, meant nothing. Tragically, she believed him." The real shock came after a night of letting off steam. At 2 a.m., Cynthia returned to her hotel to find one of Lennon's people waiting for her. His words chilled her. "He is going to divorce you, take Julian away from you, and send you back to Hoy Lake." Ouch. The final jab came when Cynthia opened the newspaper and saw John hand in hand with his new love, Yoko Ono. Paul McCartney later stopped by with a red rose and whispered, "I'm so sorry. I don't know what's come over him." The whole world would soon be wondering the same thing. Lennon was never a fan of rules, but during the recording of the White Album in 1968, he shattered one of the biggest. The band had a strict no wives or no girlfriends policy at the studio, so when Lennon strolled in with Yoko Ono by his side, jaws hit the floor. And she didn't sit quietly in the corner. She gave opinions, made suggestions, and became an unshakable fixture. Lennon later admitted that the breakup of the Beatles can be heard on that album. His new woman, new vice, and growing distance from the others were quickly becoming a recipe for disaster. The cracks in the Beatles were starting to deepen, and this time they might not heal. In January 1969, the Beatles were flying high. The White Album had just dropped, and they were working on Let It Be. It's too bad a quiet storm was brewing between the unlikeliest of bandmates, John Lennon and George Harrison. Harrison was upset that Yoko Ono had taken his place at Lennon's side. Lennon was growing jealous of how Harrison's songwriting kept getting better as Lennon floundered in a haze of substances. The worst part of this spat, it actually played out on camera. During the Let It Be sessions, the vibe between Harrison and Lennon turned downright nasty. Some even claim that it got physical. Just out of frame, Harrison, who later admitted it was a very stressful time, had had enough. He thought, "I'm not doing this anymore," and walked out. Lennon talked tough, wanting to quickly replace Harrison with Eric Clapton, but after 10 tense days, the band asked Harrison back. By March 1969, John Lennon and Yoko Ono weren't just feeding off each other's creativity, they were devouring it. Knowing their wedding would cause a media frenzy, they turned the circus into a statement. For their honeymoon, they staged a bed-in for peace, holding court from 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. each day for a week at the Amsterdam Hilton. The world had never seen anything like it. Lennon called it a commercial for peace on the front page of the papers, and the headlines were massive, but not everyone was cheering. Lennon and Ono's whirlwind of projects, films, protests, performance art was pulling Lennon further from the Beatles. The band that once got all of Lennon's energy was now left scavenging for scraps. The peace was public, but the tension behind the scenes was ready to blow. The Abbey Road sessions started in April 1969, but when tensions started to bubble, Lennon hit the road literally. Hoping for a break, he packed Yoko Ono, her daughter, and Julian into the car for a road trip to the Scottish Highlands. One problem: Lennon was an awful driver with terrible eyesight. On July 1st, 1969, he crashed the car, leaving Ono with a back injury and sending the rest of them off for stitches. Julian escaped unharmed, but the same couldn't be said for the Beatles' momentum. Lennon had his reasons for getting into the really hard stuff, but one of the most jaw-dropping, he claimed it was a way to rebel against the other Beatles for not accepting Yoko Ono as his equal. The others were already tiptoeing around Lennon's volcanic moods, but after his car crash, things got much worse. To top it all off, Lennon had a king-size bed delivered to the studio so Yoko Ono could literally lie there and supervise their sessions. The tensions were off the charts. It's no wonder Abbey Road was the last album the Beatles ever recorded together. The band broke up in April 1970. By 1973, John Lennon and Yoko Ono's once inseparable bond was cracking. The backlash after the Beatles' breakup had turned vicious. Fans blamed Yoko Ono for everything, and even wanted to hurt her. The tension was unbearable, so Ono came up with a truly bizarre fix. She told Lennon to take off with their assistant, May Pang. It sounded like a joke, even by swingin' 70s standards, but after some convincing, Pang agreed, and soon she and Lennon were on a plane to LA. What followed would be the wildest, weirdest chapter of his life. Lennon's lost weekend, as it's now referred to, in LA was an 18-month cocktail of chaos. On the plus side, Pang was a positive force who encouraged him to not only reconnect with his son Julian, but also with Paul McCartney and Ringo Starr. Unfortunately, things got messy fast as Lennon and his wild crew dove headfirst into a sea of booze and substances. Meanwhile, Yoko Ono was at home stressing that she had been missing out, calling Pang all day long. Trouble was brewing.
For exclusive perks like early access to new videos, priority replies to your comments, and to have your say on future content, consider becoming a Factinate member. On top of that, your support helps keep the channel going. Click the link in the description for more details.
All good things must come to an end, and this was true for Lennon and Pang's freewheeling time in the California sun. The couple tried nesting in a cozy New York City apartment for a while, but Yoko Ono's grip was still ironclad. Before long, she lured Lennon back, and almost instantly she was pregnant. On October 9th, 1975, John Lennon's own birthday, Sean Lennon was born, and just like that, Lennon hit pause on fame. Next, John Lennon did the unthinkable. He turned his back on superstardom and became a full-time dad. For 5 years, he baked bread, changed diapers, and tried to figure out who he was without the Beatles. But even in his quiet life, the past haunted him. When George Harrison visited, he said Lennon had wanted to say so much more, you could see it in his eyes. It was like Lennon was silently crying out to reconnect, but he wasn't able to because of the situation he was in. Whatever Lennon was holding back, he never got the chance to say it. After years out of the spotlight, Lennon was finally ready to return to music and life. In November 1980, he released Double Fantasy, a new album with Yoko Ono that felt like a fresh start. For the first time in ages, he seemed clear-headed, inspired, and even happy. Tragically, the dream wouldn't last. On the evening of December 8th, 1980, just hours after Lennon had kindly autographed a fan's album, the same man, Mark David Chapman, waited outside the Dakota with a gun. As Lennon walked towards the entrance, Chapman pulled the trigger. 4 shots hit Lennon in the back and shoulder. Paramedics rushed him to the hospital, but at 11:15 p.m., doctors pronounced him gone. He was just 40 years old. Lennon's journey of reinvention had ended just as it was beginning again. And speaking of Lennon's fight to redefine himself, we've got to take it back to his rowdy youth and that terrifying incident at Paul McCartney's 21st birthday bash. Remember when Lennon was at Paul McCartney's birthday party and the DJ made a joke about Lennon's honeymoon? It certainly hit a nerve, because when Lennon snapped, he turned the party into a horror show, beating the DJ with a stick in a brutal, bloody frenzy. He later confessed, "It was the first time I thought I could end this guy. I just saw it, like on a screen, that if I hit him once more, that was going to be it." Cynthia Powell claimed he swore he'd never lose control like that again. The DJ was never quite the same, and yet, somehow, people forgave Lennon. John Lennon rebelled against nearly everything, and in doing so, he rewrote what it meant to be an artist. If he had played it safe, he wouldn't still be messing with our heads long after the music stopped. If you enjoyed this Factinate video, give it a thumbs up and subscribe for more incredible stories. Want to say in who we cover next? Join our membership program through the link in the description for exclusive perks. Your support means everything to us. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.